A little bit about me and the ICO. So I've been at the ICO now for just short of 3 years. I'm a senior investigating officer from a previous life as a homicide investigator in the police. My department is responsible for investigating criminal and civil breaches of the Data Protection Act, and also the Freedom of Information Act and a few other regulations as well. So I have delegated powers from the Commissioner. As I say, I work closely with the Deputy Commissioners as well, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later. There are around 400 staff at the ICO. We're based in Wilmslow in Manchester, and we have a UK responsibility, a UK reach, but also touched on the international angle as well. We have offices in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. So, without further ado, I better tell you a little bit more about what we do. So, as I said, we regulate the Data Protection Act, and obviously your role within that particular link to that legislation is key to protecting personal data. We also provide advice to organisations and to individuals. We've introduced a new system whereby people can raise concerns rather than complaints, because we wanted to move away from being a customer complaints manager into an organisation that picked up trends and threats and made a difference to individuals and held organisations to account to improve their compliance. And that seems to be working further well, because the caseload's dropped, and it enables us to take a more proactive and approach rather than reacting to complaints. We also adjudicate on complaints, and we also provide good practice. You've probably seen some of our legislation, guidance documentation that is floating around. The biggest area of threat for the ICO and the general public and organisations is data loss. And I'll explain more about the principles around that, and also our powers in relation to that. But also data theft, because personal data as a commodity is increasing both in its commercial and criminal value. Is anybody familiar with the data protection principles? Yeah? I see a few nods there, which is always good news. So before I joined the organisation, I'd had various training courses, and I wouldn't say it was rammed home, but I was aware of the Data Protection Act, but certainly not to the depth that I am now. But I suppose in relation to your activity, the principles will impact mainly on the 7th principle, which is personal information must be secure, obviously, but also it will be driven, I suppose, and influenced by 4 and 5, simply because if the information is no longer accurate and the organisation can't justify its retention, obviously it'll find its way into your industry for destruction. And I guess that's going to be increasing all the time, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. So, what can we do? Well, we can issue information notices that compels an organisation to provide us with key information. If they fail to comply with the notice, they commit a contempt of court, which basically is a criminal offence, which is always good for us as an enforcement tool, and we do take people to court over that. We can issue search warrants without notice, so we can arrive at the premises and gain access, having sworn evidence before a judge. But we can also issue demand for access notices, which is a with notice warrant. In other words, telling a company to provide us with information within 7 days. We can issue enforcement notices, which tells an organisation to stop processing data a particular way and do it a different way. And if the organisation commits an offence, they commit a criminal act, and again we can prosecute those. So that's left me in an interesting position when some of the chief constables have been a little bit resistant to dealing with an enforcement notice. We can issue fines up to £500,000, which is quite substantial, and that's going to change quite significantly when the EU regulations come in, and they will be coming in, but I can't give you a date as to when. And we can also conduct compulsory audits for certain government departments, and we also conduct voluntary audits. This is where organisations ask us to come in and audit their processes. And last but not least, we can issue undertakings, which is an informal process, non-legally binding, which is like sort of a gentleman's agreement between the ICO and the organisation concerned to change the way that they process personal data. Are you with me so far? Okay, so personal data is a commodity. I said it's definitely increasing in its commercial and criminal value. A lot of organised crimes now are moving into this particular area because the deterrent effect is very low. At the moment we can only fine individuals. There's no maximum on the fine. But what we can also do, if we secure a conviction, we can also seize the assets under the Proceeds of Crime Act, which is always good, and we've just secured something like 70k from an organisation who were committing criminal offences. And again, commercially, obviously, the processing, proliferation of personal data, the way that it's transferred in between organisations, both domestically and internationally, is phenomenal, and it's definitely going to improve substantially as technology develops. And then there we have the proposed EU regulations. I've got a slide covering that. And then there are some concerns with regard to use of social networking sites. And for those that use social networking sites, maybe you've been using it for the last 10, 15 years. But if you think about the next generation coming through, the sort of stuff that they post online, it's quite frightening how open they are with their personal data, and it makes them really vulnerable. So we are working with the social networking sites and obviously education to change that. Well, the public attitude toward privacy is quite interesting because 88% of respondents believe that protecting personal data is definitely an issue of significant social importance. 62% believe they've lost an element of control over their personal information. Now, one of the things that we investigate is cold calling and text messages, and I'm sure that people have had them in the room. So that's on the privacy and enforcement privacy electronic communications regulations, and we're the UK lead in relation to that, working closely with Ofcom. And quite often people say, how the hell did that organisation get all of my personal data? Well, there's loads of ways it can find its way illegally through to organisations. It can be stolen. You could offer up your data when you actually buy something online or sign a contract, and it's amazing how many people miss their terms and conditions because they're about 25 pages long, and who the hell wants to read those? And the next thing you know, you're getting bombarded with calls. So that's another reason why personal data is important. And then obviously we've got the processing, storage, retrieval and destruction of personal data. And I think the stats tell us that 60% of small businesses have reported a security breach during 2014. And you can see the average cost there to the organisation because there is remedial measures they need to introduce, like for example technical measures to improve the systems, penetration testing and so on and so on. So it's quite substantial. And then lurking behind the scenes is the ICO as a regulator, and we can slot the fine on as well. So there is a lot at stake. I don't suppose I need to tell you about the international standard, the ISO 27002. But information's risk, security and management is very, very important. And just out of sort of interest, are any of you CSIROs in your organisation? I don't suppose you see that much in the private sector. Is there something similar, like asset information owners or anything like that? No. Senior information risk officers? No. It's more and more prevalent and within the public sector. And there are the trends. Okay, so a little bit of a caveat in relation to this. This sort of trends data is drawn from our complaint system. So in the main, we get reports from the public sector rather than the private sector. But this just gives you an indication of where we are. So you can see by far is the disclosure in error, and then we have lost and stolen paperwork, lost and stolen hardware. So I was on the way down in the train, I was looking at 2, 3, 5 and 8, which might impact on some of the work that you do. What do you reckon the common denominator is in the trends?
Poor training.
Yeah, okay. Any others? Well, I was going to flag up the fact that there's a human factor in all those things, because if you think about the roles within organisations, one individual or two individuals may have a responsibility for making sure that training is delivered, making sure that the systems they've got in place are up to scratch, like penetration testing, making sure that materials handled correctly and stored securely and shredded securely and so on and so on. And then of course you've got the individual or individuals who are actually tasked with doing the shredding itself, and obviously we all make mistakes, but it's making sure that it's staying on top of the processes and systems in place, making sure that you've got the right staff who are trained and who are equipped and skilled to carry out those tasks. So look, as I say, the majority of the information we get is from the public sector, and I'll explain a little bit more about our strategy in relation to that. That's just an extract from the from BIS in relation to the impact that security breaches have, and it's quite interesting what they have to say. Okay, so but what happens when we have a data breach incident? And it could come in any way. It could come as an unlawful disclosure, it could come as I say, human error. There's all sorts of information that finds its way into the public domain. Hard drives go missing, unencrypted laptops go missing, people do lose information on the way to it being shredded. Organisations who are compelled or tasked to shred hard drives turn out to pass it on to a third party, and there is a case study that highlights that particular problem. But here you can see, in some cases there is a risk of real harm and distress to individuals, and lives can be put at risk because of that. There's always a possibility of fraud if the information finds itself into the criminal network, and serious financial loss for some really vulnerable people that we have out in our communities. And then, of course, there's the physical and emotional well-being of individuals and their embarrassment and reputational damage that can cause. But the reputational damage that it can cause organisations, of course, is quite substantial, because on the one hand, the ISO could issue a fine, but obviously in comparison to the reputational damage and the effect that might have on you winning a particular contract, again, is quite substantial. So the seventh principle of the Data Protection Authority just say that organisations should have the appropriate technical and organisational measures in place to protect against unlawful access to or unlawful processing of personal data. And again, there's a catch-all there about accidental loss and destruction or damage to personal data. And this is what we're seeing. So we're seeing loss or theft of data on encrypted devices, and I don't suppose you'll be surprised if I tell you that some of the circumstances where information goes missing is just bizarre, and you couldn't make it up. Discarded data, recycled IT equipment, which seems to be a bit more prevalent now, where an organisation may be going through a disposal programme because they're renewing their assets. The next thing is that finds its way onto eBay, and some individual buys that particular hard drive and comes across medical records for thousands and thousands of patients, and we've seen that quite often. So that's some work that we're doing at the moment in relation to a proactive initiative. And then we have decommissioned sites. These are quite often organisations, certainly in the public sector, because of the severe cuts now that are being made over the last 3 or 4 years, and yesterday we found out there's probably going to be more, so that's going to be interesting, whereby organisations downsize, and quite often they leave material and buildings exposed to the public, and there's again high risk associated to that. Inappropriate access controls, passwords being shared, areas that should be secure aren't secure, people wandering in and out, helping themselves to laptops and stuff like that. There's loads of risk, and again that's a human factor. And then we have the hacking attacks, which again seems quite prevalent, so quite a number of individuals across the globe are pretty good at hacking systems, which is frightening. And then of course we have the data theft. This is where people con their way into public organisations normally and obtain personal data by pretending to be the customer, and that's so. Are you all familiar about the relationship between a data controller and data processors? Just a nod of the head would be good, or a shake. Yeah? So is this the sort of thing that's driven, I suppose, into your day-to-day practices, this area of responsibility? It's probably worth visiting our website at some time if you can get time to do that, because there's a lot of information that just sets out the various responsibilities. But at the end of the day, it's for data controller, it normally says any person, but it's an organisation normally, or either who alone or jointly with other persons, determines the purposes and the manner. So that's the key, the purposes and the manner of the way personal data is processed. And then we have the responsibilities there in relation to the data, well, the criteria in relation to the data processor. But mainly, it's the data controller who has responsibility for making sure that personal data is kept secure. So I'm guessing that in your work with the data controller, you will have policies and procedures in place that, you know, hold you to account. Is that the case?
Yeah. In our customers' premises, is more of an impact, really.
Okay.
We're serving those clients.
Okay. Yeah. And is that revisited on a regular basis, the contracts? And yeah. Okay. I don't suppose I need to spend much time on that, because it seems that you don't have that in your particular area. But all this is related to information assurance, you know, governance, tight governance around assets and information. So our role is to protect, well, our key role is to uphold the privacy rights of individuals and also protect them from unlawful disclosure of their information. So normally we will conduct an investigation. Okay, so as I say, I've got around 55 staff. I've got 6 teams, and I'll touch on that in a second. But normally what we'll do, we will investigate a case where we've had a situation where one or more of the principles has been breached. And normally it's where data subjects have been affected because they've had the rights infringed, because they've been subject and exposed. We may investigate potential breaches rather than actual, if we spot something, basically to mitigate risk, so that measures can be put in place across a sector or within an organisation. And we may investigate in isolation or in collaboration with other regulators, for example the FCA, Financial Conduct Authority, Solicitor Regulatory Authority, and other organisations across the globe. What normally happens is that we receive a self-reported breach form from an organisation, and Adam was asking just before lunch was finished about, you know, where we get our referrals from, and I have to say that in the main we get our referrals from the public sector, and one of the reasons behind that is because of the data loss that occurred with the HMRC, where they lost millions of personal data files when their laptop went missing. So on the back of that, it was deemed as good practice if organisations in the public sector contacted the ICO and told them about particular breaches. Now, we have had some breaches reported to us directly from the private sector, and one thing for sure is that we are tracking intelligence all the time. About 12 months ago I introduced an intelligence hub into our organisation because we weren't very good at picking up new trends and threats, so that's something that's in place. We have 6 staff involved in that, and they'll analyse intelligence products from whistleblowers, from the media, from pressure groups, from members of the public who think they've been wronged, and all the time we're hoovering up intelligence and analysing that and converting that into activity. As I say, it's easier for us to get that the activity moving or investigation completed from when we're getting information from the public sector. So once we start the investigation, one thing that we look at is the post-incident management. In other words, the organisation making quick action, remedial action in order to try and recover the data. That might be involving the police to search a particular area. It could involve bringing people to account, calling a meeting, a goal group, a COBA group, or whatever you want to call it, to make things happen in terms of managing the actual incident itself. But the one thing for sure is you need details as to what went wrong, who was involved, and where to find the information. Quite often the ICO will step in and we'll provide support to the data controller, but we'll also be conducting our investigation at that particular time. So we're looking for any major breaches where substantial damage or distress has been caused to individuals or is likely because of the data loss. And again, was it deliberate? Did the organisation know about it and not put their measures in place? Should they have known about it, because that's their responsibility under the Data Protection Act. We'll also look behind in terms of recent cases, look at their organisational behaviour, look at previous complaints and so on. So we're not just looking at that case in isolation, we'll look at previous behaviour. And as a result of that, we'll make a decision whether to impose a fine. And as I say, that could be up to 500k, which is quite substantial. And again, around data breach prevention, Organisations, particularly the data controller, needs to identify and understand the risk, because it's different per organisation. If you think about the health sector, the sort of the information they will have, it's quite impactful. And then we'll look at whether they've got effective data security and governance processes in place. It could be due diligence issues, general governance, escalation up to chief executive, whereby the data protection officer is no longer seen in isolation and is marginalised. They're actually brought as part of the general security governance, and then training and procedures. So one of the things I was asked to flag up today is that a specialist service provider could be considered a data processor under the Data Protection Act. Good practice suggests that written contract must be in place between the data controller and the processor, and the policies and procedures absolutely clear so that both parties understand what the parameters of operation are. And also, a responsibility of asset disposal is assigned to a member of staff with a relevant level of experience and expertise. Again, one of the things we've found is that quite often the assets that has to be disposed of, whether that's paper or hard drive, quite often aren't scheduled to the sort of detail and accuracy that they should be, and that's something that maybe you could make sure happens, and then obviously check that off. Again, consider the security vulnerabilities associated with each method of disposal, and then ensure personal data is deleted before recycling devices. Think about the hard drives that might find their way back into the public domain through eBay. So, well, has anybody got any questions so far? Stunned silence.
You mentioned about data controllers.
Yeah.
Do you think the SME market even understand what a data controller is?
No, absolutely not. When you think about the scale of some of the organisations, whereby you've got, well, it could be 2-3 individuals working from a small premises. Sometimes it could be one individual. They just haven't got, the sustainability and the systems and processes in place. And we've recently run some events through the UK for SMEs. Our audit team led on that. And my team are going to be delivering about, I think it's 6 presentations across the UK in the next 4 to 6 months targeting SMEs. Because I think they're not aware of their responsibilities, and I think if we can increase or improve our reach into that particular area, I think that'll improve things. Yeah.
Do you think there's anything we could do as two organisations, the BSIA and the ICO, to work closer? Because obviously when the EU directive comes in, that's going to be much wide-ranging powers, and more people are going to be open to data protection fines.
Yeah.
So, 6 seminars is great, but actually if there's 2 million SME companies out there, how are they all going to be touched by knowing what the legislation is?
Well, I think you made a really important and valid point there, because some of our work does bring us directly into contact with trade associations, and particularly in the financial sector, and also direct marketing. But we see that we can have a really close and strong working relationship with trade associations, because quite often they're the closest, if you like, to the industry and practices, and they listen to. I think that they can send out some key messages and alerts, and that's something that we need to improve on in our particular area. So yeah, in answer to your question, it is something that you can help in, and it's something that we can take forward, I think.
Could you not get it with could you not get ISO controllers or auditors to write it into policies? So if your people worked on sort of educating men or writing ISO policies, they could actually write it in there, couldn't they? That
I think probably, yeah. I think it'd be worth
a message through, maybe.
Yeah, I think it'd be worth exploring. And what I was going to encourage, if there is a feeling within the BSIA that we can do more by working together. I think if you set out some of the ideas in relation to what you'd like to see happening, we'll obviously take that forward, and I can speak to our policy delivery team and our strategic liaison. And I'm not sure whether you've already got contacts with our strategic liaison or not.
I mean, our technical director now. I'll double check.
Yeah, but we can work up that, and we can promote that as a
interesting to explore that.
Yeah. Definitely. Okay. Is anybody familiar with this particular case? Okay. Was you involved in?
We were a bit worried at first.
Okay.
But
Right.
it's nothing to do with us. We do look after that trust with the paper, but not the
Okay.
not the IT.
Yeah. Well, perhaps as well. Yeah. It was embarrassment all around, and as you can see, the headline there is 325k fine. It's quite substantial, but I think moreover, you know, the reputational damage that was caused to that particular trust was quite substantial, and this was a case of hard drives being passed to a third party who basically wasn't sticking to the rules and the contract, and obviously shredding the data, and it found its way into the public domain. But if you look at the numbers involved, there are 67,000, you know, it's a hell of a lot of data subjects, and you know, the actual category there, 1,500 HIV patients, it's big hitting stuff, you know. So again, we investigated that. We ended up at the first tier tribunal, which is normally the appeal process that organisations have. If they're not happy with it, well, it could be two things: A, the fine, and B, the amount that they're being fined. And we won that at first tribunal, and then there is a course of redress, if you like, for the organisation. They could have taken us to the upper tier tribunal, but they chose not to. I think probably because, you know, they knew they were in a difficult position, and the fine was issued. Now, normally if organisations pay within a certain time, they get a 20% discount, which is interesting. What happens to the money then that we get? Anybody know? You want to know?
Yes, I do.
If you win the car park, you'll see a Lambert. No, that's not what happens. Basically, it goes to a so-called consolidated fund, and then this is a fund run by the government, and normally they'll distribute it to all sorts of, you know, good causes and public serving issues. Now, what we're looking at doing is seeing if we can tap into that so that we can convert that into that sort, you know, the programs that you just suggested with SMEs, that sort of approach. And we are encouraging, if you like, at European level, whereby the polluter pays, that sort of principle. And this is a little bit more about the EU regulation. So I have to say, from my perspective, I've been involved and consulted with the ICO, because a lot of the articles that are being considered within the EU regulation impact on my area of work. But it's worrying in one respect, but, you know, reassuring in another. And next week I'm going over to Poland to meet some colleagues from other DPAs, because what we're going to be looking at is how we can better coordinate our enforcement action, because of the exchanging data across, you know, Europe and across the world. It's much more prevalent than it was 10 years ago, and it is a significant risk. So that's something that we're working on. The additional responsibilities I mentioned for data controllers in the public sector is likely to migrate over to the private sector. So long will be the days, I suppose, gone will be the days whereby you have an option whether to report an incident or not. It's looking like it's going to be mandatory. And what does that mean for the organisations? Well, you know, they're going to have to tighten up substantially in terms of the governance, because I think we all know in this room that there is a lot of underreporting going on in the private sector, and that's something that we need to improve on. So it will also impact on our workload, because obviously we'll be getting, well, I don't know, it could increase fourfold. I just don't know. It's you know, finger in the air stuff. But we'll just have to see. And this is the bit that's we're going to find awkward about the ICO discretion, because at the moment we've got the discretion whether to investigate a case. We don't have to. You know, we've got that discretion. We've also got the discretion of whether we issue a fine or not, enforcement notice and so on. But the EU regulation will bind us into making sure that we take action to protect the privacy rights of individuals, and you know, we haven't got that opt-out option. So that's going to change our culture a little bit. And then the fine regime, which is the big hitting stuff. So if you look at that, you know, €1 million, or in the case of an enterprise, the figure 2%, it might move to 5%. So if you think about an organisation like Google, you know, £1 billion worth of turnover, just convert that to 5%. I mean, that's big figures, isn't it? So we'll just have to see how that pans out. And I think that's it. So, questions? Anybody got anything to want to ask? Anybody got any concerns about the ICO, the way that we're...
Was that hospital the biggest prosecution fine that's been
For a data breach?
Yeah.
Yeah. We did. We issued a fine for 440k for text messages, but we lost that case at the tribunal. But in terms of the data loss, that's the biggest one. But there are others in the pipeline.
I'm just thinking of, I mean, recently everyone gets involved with like PPI text messages, and it seems that doesn't stop. It's in fact probably increased, isn't it?
Yeah, it has increased, and I don't know whether you're tracking this, and the consultation date expires on the 7th, but we put a business case to government to change the legislation. So at the moment, in relation to cold calls and text messages, we have to prove substantial damage and distress, which is difficult. Normally we have to rely on terminally ill patients and the elderly, vulnerable members of the community who've been bombarded with calls and so on to get that home. But what we're proposing is that they reduce the threshold altogether, so that if somebody commits a breach, we can at least consider issuing them a fine from 1 pence to 500k, depending on the scale.
Well, what do you consider it to be bombarded with calls? Just on a personal level, I'm kind of getting 6 calls a week, all about an accident that I've never had. They say, oh, you've not yet claimed for the accident that's happened within the last 2 years, and unless I've got complete dementia, I haven't had an accident in the last 2 years.
Well, that's what we're finding, and this goes back to the heart of what I was saying about personal data and the way that it finds itself from, let's say, a collection point. It could be anything: purchase of, car parking, Manchester Airport online. Purchase of a brand new pair of shoes from London, but it's the transaction that normally results in someone's personal data being obtained. And the golden nugget for the list brokers and the claims industry is contact number. So what they'll do, they'll just send out mass text. I'm talking millions of texts here, and it can be done remotely. It can be done on a laptop. You don't have to be set up in a call centre. You can do it from your back bedroom or in a garage. So it's really these cases are really difficult to investigate because of, I suppose, the stealth that these individuals operate. But obviously it's big money, But we are doing a lot of work. We have had some substantial success. We work quite closely with the claims management regulator, regulator I should say, who represent the Ministry of Justice. So they've made some regulatory changes as well. Any other questions?
How do you regulate companies that store information in the cloud?
Sorry, give us that again.
How do you regulate companies storing information in the cloud?
The same way. I mean, it's not really in the cloud, is it? It's probably in a basement in China, or but exactly the same process. Data controllers who have operating centres in the UK have got responsibility for adhering to the Data Protection Act, and just because it's so-called dropping into the cloud and disappearing, they've still got the same levels of responsibility. And I don't know, it's going to be interesting, I think, going forward over the next 2-3 years to see how all this develops, because, as I say, the technical advances and improvements in technologies is just moving at such a pace. Honestly, it's frightening. It really is. But we've issued quite a lot of guidance in relation to that. We're working with other regulators across the globe in that particular area. We're looking at the Internet of Things. I think, did you see that article on remote cameras the other day? Did anybody see that?
Yeah.
Whereby, if you don't set the password default, that somebody could be watching you, and anywhere in the world, it turns out it's a Russian website that was putting this online. So again, lots of concerns. Even with your tablet, somebody can take over that and watch you, doing things. I think there's a lady in the bath who saw this happening to her, and obviously causing a lot of distress. So, the advances in technology, that's one of the reasons why we have a bespoke technical department who work closer with this, because cybernet, security in general is a concern. Hacking obviously is a concern. Foreign powers accessing, our databases is a concern, and so on and so on. So personal data is a valuable commodity. Yeah. Any others before I'm booted off?
How many fines have you issued in the last 12 months?
Why didn't I read up on that? I think, listen, you probably have to check this. I think it's over 1.5 million, I think.
What, pounds or people?
Pounds, yeah, 1.5 million, but not, It depends. It depends, I suppose, on our opportunities. One of the things that we're faced with is when we start an investigation, they tend to be quite lengthy, because as soon as the data controller knows that the regulator's sniffing around, they normally engage the lawyers, and then we'll get an answer on a Monday, which changes on a Friday, and then, you know, there's representations, there's all sorts going on. So the investigations can be quite lengthy. But ordinarily speaking, I think we probably issue about, say, 15 to 20 CMPs. That's what we're aiming for per year, of a different magnitude. But we have to, I mean, obviously we've got our discretion, but we have to take a proportionate response, and that don't mean hammering everybody, you know, with a fine. That's not the way that we work. What we're looking at is cases that actually cause, you know, distress and damage. Yeah, but it's worth having a look on the website.
To your knowledge, do you know of any shredding companies or recycling companies that have been in breach of the Data Protection Act?
Well, apart from the one that's on there, no. But if anybody's got any intelligence, no, seriously. Just that, go on.
No, it's our solicitor's always advising us that we're a data processor, and we're always arguing to say we're not processing the data, we're processing the medium it's on. But until there's a test case, we've written it into our policies and procedures, we're a data processor.
Okay, that's interesting.
But it's interesting to see
I
the
mind
ICOs.
picking up that with you on, you know, similar work stream to the one I mentioned before. I think it needs exploring that, because we do give policy guidance. Normally, what we'll do is, if we see that there's a threat in a certain area, we'll try and reach out to the trade associations and, you know, find out whether they're coming across any particular issues. And I suppose the trade associations do need to trust the ICO, because if they do share with information, how is that going to affect their members? That's one issue. But sometimes we will publicise a particular threat and invite whistleblowers. So sometimes people can find themselves in a difficult position with an organisation where they see practices that are putting the organisation at risk, and obviously personal data, and they're not comfortable with it. Sometimes they've spoke to the managers, they've been told to, you know, do one, and nobody's listening to them. So it's not something that I'm hearing on a regular basis, which is good news, isn't it? Now, what's happening underneath the surface? No, I shouldn't be flippant on that, because that's important to us. What we need to understand by working with a trade association is, you know, the accuracy of the threat, if there is a threat. But I think it's probably low. I think the risk is high, obviously, but the threat is probably low. Any other questions?
Do you think the new EU legislation will make that much of a difference, apart from the kind of the big companies? Because isn't it a bit like me ringing up the highways agency saying I'm doing 80 on the motorway? People are not going to self-declare unless they get caught out, really, are they? Unless they're a big company with proper processes and procedures. If you're an SME, the chances of you knowing about legislation and adhering to it, because all the negative publicity and the cost and everything else, do you think it actually will have much of an impact?
I think it will have an impact. Certainly have an impact on our work. I think it'll have an impact on the bigger organisations, as you say, because I reckon, and we get asked this on a fairly regular basis, although it's not my area of expertise, is about you know, what's coming down the track, what can we do now to prepare for 2 years' time and make sure we've got everything in place. But in terms of the SMEs, you know, that outreach work that I touched on before, that's something that we're going to have to ramp up big time. I think we need to issue some key messages, and again, you know, trade association helping us to deliver that, and somehow help us to, you know, govern and enforce that would be useful, because maybe one of the conditions of being a member of a particular association is that, you know, you adhere to industry guidelines and so on, and if you don't, obviously there's a potential you'll get booted out or held to account, and of course there's a regulator as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. It's difficult to predict, you know, but I can just see a landscape whereby we get more reports. I can see a landscape whereby the ICO has got a much closer involvement with the trade associations in delivering key messages, and also issuing industry guidance. Yeah.
And presumably the government are not going to give you a stack of new funding to triple the size of the organisation.
Well, it doesn't look so, and I'm not saying that would be right anyway, but what's interesting is that the current government are anti-EU anyway, So, you know, they're very resistant to the regulation going through. We'll just have to see how things play out, but the common feeling seems to be that at some stage the EU regs will get through. 2017's, you know, been suggested, but again, it's difficult to say. Okay.
Thanks, Steve.
Right, I just want to, you know, thank you all obviously for your interest, and thank you all for your questions. If someone has a question, you know, that's pecking away at your head, by all means send it through to me. It's not got my slide up, but Christine has got my details, and you know, I can get back to you on that with an answer. And then obviously look forward to perhaps exploring how we can work together in the future. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Steve.